penniless orphan defended a humiliated old woman, never knowing she was the Duke's mother. The shout cut through the marketplace like a whip crack, sharp enough to make every head turn. Alara Voss froze mid-step, a basket of mended shirts balanced on her hip, as she watched three well-dressed merchants surround a frail old woman near the bread stall. One of them, a heavy-set man with a gold ring on every finger, grabbed the woman's wrist and yanked her forward so hard she stumbled and nearly fell. "You think you can steal from me and walk away?" he snarled, his voice loud enough for the whole square to hear. The old woman's basket had spilled, loaves of bread rolling into the mud, and her thin hands trembled as she tried to gather them back up. She was small, wrapped in a gray shawl that had seen too many winters, her white hair escaping from beneath a plain cap. She did not look like a thief. She looked like someone who had simply been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. "I paid you," the old woman said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "I placed the coins in your hand not a minute ago." "Liar," the merchant spat, and he raised his hand as if to strike her. Alara did not think. She dropped her basket and pushed through the gathering crowd, placing herself between the merchant and the old woman, before anyone could stop her. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat, but her voice came out clear and firm. "Touch her again and you will answer to the whole market," Alara said, staring the man down. Around them, a small crowd had gathered, murmuring, some pulling their children closer, none stepping forward to help. The merchant's face turned red with fury. "And who are you to interfere, girl? Some ragged nobody who mends old clothes for coppers?" "I am someone who saw you take her coins with my own eyes," Alara lied without hesitation, though she had seen no such thing. She had only seen the old woman's fear and the merchant's cruelty, and that was reason enough. "If you want to argue about it, we can walk to the constable together right now." The threat of the constable made the merchant hesitate. He looked around at the crowd, aware that eyes were on him, that whispers were already spreading through the square. He was a man who valued his reputation more than a few loaves of bread. With a final glare, he shoved the empty basket toward the old woman's feet and turned away, muttering curses under his breath as his companions followed him, casting uneasy glances over their shoulders. The moment he was gone, Alara knelt down and began gathering the fallen bread, brushing off the dirt as best she could. The old woman knelt beside her, her hands still shaking, though now it seemed less from fear and more from something else, something Alara could not quite name. "You did not have to do that," the old woman said quietly. "Nobody else was going to," Alara answered simply, placing the last loaf back in the basket. She noticed then how the woman's hands, though wrinkled and spotted with age, were remarkably soft, without the calluses of someone who had spent a lifetime doing hard labor. It was a small detail, easy to miss, but Alara's eyes had always been sharp, trained by years of watching people closely to know who could be trusted and who could not. "I have no way to repay you," the old woman said, glancing at the basket of bread that had cost her the argument in the first place. "You do not need to repay me," Alara said, reaching into the small pouch tied at her waist. She counted out a few worn copper coins, more than half of what she had earned that morning from selling mended clothes, and pressed them into the old woman's palm before she could protest. "Take this, for the bread. Consider it settled." The old woman stared at the coins in her hand, then at Alara's face, studying her with an intensity that seemed strange for someone who had just been humiliated in public. There was something in her gaze, sharp and searching, that made Alara feel as though she were being measured against some invisible standard, though she could not have said what that standard might be. "What is your name, child?" the old woman asked. "Alara. Alara Voss." "And why did you help me, Alara Voss, when everyone else in this square chose to look away?" Alara considered the question for a moment before answering. "Because nobody ever helped me either, when I needed it most, and I decided a long time ago that if I ever saw someone being treated unfairly, I would not just stand there and watch." The old woman's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, something like sorrow passed across her face, quickly hidden behind a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," she said. "My name is Agnes." "Just Agnes?" Alara asked, curious despite herself. "Just Agnes," the old woman confirmed, though something in the way she said it made Alara wonder if there was more to the name than she was letting on. They sat together for a while longer near the bread stall, the morning crowd slowly returning to its usual bustle around them as though nothing had happened at all. Alara learned little about Agnes in that first conversation, only that she was new to the area, that she preferred simple food and simple company, and that she asked far more questions than she answered. Agnes wanted to know about Alara's parents, about how she had come to live alone, about what she dreamed of doing with her life if circumstances were different. Alara did not usually share such things with strangers, but there was something about Agnes that put her at ease. a quiet warmth beneath the guarded exterior that made her feel, oddly, as though she were talking to someone who had known her for years rather than minutes. She told her about her parents, both gone now for 3 years, taken by a fever that had swept through the town during a particularly harsh winter. She told her about the small room she rented above a cobbler's shop, about the mending work that barely covered her rent, about her secret hope of one day saving enough to open a proper shop of her own, however distant that dream might seem. Agnes listened to all of it without interruption, nodding occasionally, her sharp eyes never leaving Alara's face. When Alara finally ran out of things to say, feeling suddenly embarrassed at having spoken so freely to a stranger, Agnes reached out and patted her hand gently. "You have a good heart, child," she said. "Do not let this world convince you to harden it. There is enough cruelty in it already, without you adding to the count." Before Alara could respond, a bell rang somewhere across the square, marking the hour, and Agnes rose slowly to her feet, gathering her shawl around her shoulders. "I should go," she said. "But I hope our paths cross again, Alara Voss." "I hope so too," Alara said, and she meant it more than she expected to. She watched as Agnes walked away, moving through the crowd with a grace that seemed at odds with her plain clothing, disappearing around a corner before Alara could call out another word. It was only after she had gone that Alara noticed something strange. Agnes had left behind a small handkerchief, dropped near where she had been sitting, and when Alara picked it up to return it, she noticed the fine embroidery along its edge, delicate stitching in silver thread that would have cost more than Alara earned in a month. She turned the handkerchief over in her hands, frowning slightly, wondering how a woman dressed so plainly could carry something so fine. But the market was busy, and there were shirts to sell and coins to earn before the day ended. So she tucked the handkerchief into her pouch and pushed the question to the back of her mind, telling herself it did not matter. Agnes was simply an old woman who had fallen on hard times, perhaps a servant who had once worked in a wealthy household and kept a single treasured item from better days. It was not so unusual a thing. Still, as Alara returned to her stall and began arranging her mended clothes for the afternoon crowd, she found her thoughts drifting back to the encounter more than once. There had been something in the way Agnes carried herself, something in the calm authority of her voice even while surrounded by angry men, that did not quite match the picture of a simple old woman down on her luck. It was a small thing, easy to dismiss, and Alara told herself she was imagining details that were not really there. The rest of her day passed as it always did, selling what she could, mending what needed mending, watching the sun climb and fall across the market square. By evening, her feet ached and her hands were sore from needlework, but her pouch was slightly heavier than it had been, and for that she was grateful. She walked home through streets growing dim with the coming night, past shop fronts closing their shutters and lamplighters beginning their rounds, her mind still occasionally circling back to the strange old woman and her softly spoken words. "You have a good heart, child. Do not let this world convince you to harden it." It was strange, Alara thought, how a handful of words from a stranger could settle so deeply into her chest, staying with her long after the encounter itself had ended. She did not know, as she climbed the narrow stairs to her small rented room and settled in for the night, that this was only the beginning of something far larger than a single kind act in a crowded market square. She did not know that the woman she had defended without a second thought carried a name and a history that would, in time, change the entire course of her life. She only knew that somewhere out there, an old woman named Agnes was walking home too, carrying with her the memory of a penniless orphan who had stood up for a stranger without asking for anything in return. And that memory would prove far more powerful than either of them could have imagined that evening, as the market emptied and the lamps flickered on along the quiet streets. A heavy fist pounded on the door of Alara's rented room before the sun had even fully risen, jolting her awake with a start. She scrambled up, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, and opened the door to find her landlord, a stern-faced man named Edmund Price, standing in the hallway with his arms crossed. "Rent is due today," he said flatly. "All of it, no more waiting." "I have most of it," Alara said quickly, reaching for the small tin box where she kept her savings. "I only need a few more days for the rest." "I have heard that before," Edmund said, his tone sharp with impatience. "If you cannot pay by sundown, you will need to find somewhere else to sleep. I have a family waiting to move in who can pay on time." He turned and left before she could argue further, his footsteps echoing down the narrow stairwell. Alara stood in the doorway for a long moment, her stomach twisting with worry. She counted the coins in her tin box twice, hoping the number might change, but it remained stubbornly short of what she needed. The morning's market earnings would have to be extraordinary to close the gap, and extraordinary mornings were not something she could count on. She dressed quickly and hurried to the market square, her basket of mended clothes clutched tightly against her chest. her mind racing through every possible way to earn a little extra before the day was done. The square was already filling with the usual morning crowd, vendors calling out their wares, children weaving between the stalls, the smell of fresh bread and roasted chestnuts filling the cool air. Alara set up her stall in its usual spot near the old stone fountain and began arranging her goods, trying to push the weight of her worry aside long enough to focus on the work in front of her. She had barely finished setting out her mended shirts when a familiar voice called her name. She looked up to see Agnes approaching, wrapped in the same gray shawl as before, moving through the crowd with that same quiet grace that seemed so out of place for a woman of her supposed circumstances. "Alara Voss," Agnes said warmly, a small smile crossing her lined face. "I hoped I might find you here again." "Agnes," Alara said, surprised at how genuinely glad she felt to see the old woman. "I did not expect to see you so soon. I have your handkerchief, actually. You left it behind yesterday." She reached into her pouch and retrieved the delicate square of silver-embroidered cloth, holding it out. Agnes took it gently, running her thumb over the fine stitching with an expression Alara could not quite read, something between fondness and sorrow. "Thank you for keeping this safe," Agnes said quietly. "It belonged to someone very dear to me. I would have been sorry to lose it." They fell into easy conversation as the morning crowd moved around them, Agnes asking after Alara's night, Alara answering honestly about the visit from her landlord, and the looming deadline for her rent. She had not meant to share so much, but something about Agnes made honesty come easily, as though the old woman's presence created a small pocket of calm in an otherwise anxious day. "That sounds like a heavy burden for such young shoulders," Agnes said, her brow furrowing with concern. "How much do you still need?" "It does not matter," Alara said quickly, embarrassed at having complained. "I will manage. I always do." Agnes studied her for a long moment, then reached into a small pocket sewn into her shawl and withdrew a single silver coin, far more valuable than anything Alara typically earned in a week. She held it out. "I cannot accept that," Alara said immediately, shaking her head. "You already gave me your thanks. I do not need payment for kindness." "This is not payment," Agnes said firmly. "Consider it a loan between friends, if that makes it easier to accept. You may repay me whenever you are able, or not at all, if that is how fortune decides to unfold. But I will not stand by and watch you lose your home over a matter I could easily help with." Alara hesitated, torn between pride and practicality, staring at the silver coin glinting in Agnes's outstretched palm. Finally, with great reluctance, she accepted it, murmuring her thanks, though something in her chest twisted uncomfortably at the thought of owing anyone anything, even someone as gentle as Agnes. "I will repay you," she said firmly, "every copper of it." "I do not doubt that for a moment," Agnes said, smiling. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion nearby, raised voices drawing the attention of the surrounding stalls. Alara turned to see a young woman named Clara Ashford, who ran a rival stall selling ribbons and lace just a few paces away, arguing loudly with a customer who claimed she had been shortchanged. Clara had never liked Alara, viewing her mended clothes as unwelcome competition for the attention of market shoppers, and the two had exchanged more than a few sharp words over the months since Alara had first set up her stall. "That is not my concern," Clara snapped at the customer, though her voice carried further than she perhaps intended, drawing curious glances from nearby vendors. "If you cannot count your own coins properly, that is hardly my fault." The argument continued for several minutes, growing more heated, until the customer finally stormed off in frustration, leaving Clara fuming behind her stall. When her eyes landed on Alara and Agnes watching from a short distance away, her expression soured further. "What are you staring at?" Clara called out sharply. "Go back to your rags and leave decent business alone." Alara felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment, but she said nothing, unwilling to add fuel to an already unpleasant morning. Agnes, however, watched the exchange with quiet interest, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly as she studied Clara's flustered expression. "She seems to carry a great deal of anger for someone so young," Agnes murmured, almost to herself. "She has never liked me," Alara admitted. "She thinks I take customers away from her stall." "Do you?" "I do not think so," Alara said honestly. "But perhaps it does not matter what I think. What matters is what she believes, and she has decided to believe the worst." Agnes nodded slowly, as though filing this small piece of information away for later consideration, though Alara could not have guessed why an old woman's opinion of a market rivalry would matter to anyone at all. Over the following days, Agnes returned to the market again and again, always finding her way to Alara's stall sometime during the morning or early afternoon. She brought small gifts on occasion, a warm scarf against the growing autumn chill, a jar of honey to sweeten Alara's evening tea, always insisting they were simple tokens of friendship rather than charity. Ilara, in turn, began to look forward to these visits more than she cared to admit, finding in Agnes a steady, calming presence that had been missing from her life since her parents had passed. One afternoon, as they sat together near the fountain sharing a small loaf of bread between them, Agnes asked a question that caught Ilara off guard. "If you could have anything in this world, Ilara Voss, anything at all, what would you ask for?" Ilara considered the question seriously, watching a group of children chase each other around the fountain's edge, their laughter bright and carefree in a way she barely remembered feeling herself. "I do not think I would ask for riches," she said slowly. "I have seen what money does to people, how it can make them cruel or careless with others. I think, if I could have anything, I would ask for a place where I truly belonged, somewhere I was valued for who I am, rather than what I can offer. I have been alone for so long that I sometimes forget what it feels like to matter to anyone." Agnes was quiet for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before she spoke again, her voice softer than Ilara had heard it before. "You matter more than you know," she said. "Sometimes the people who deserve the most kindness are the ones who have learned to expect the least of it." Ilara did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing, simply resting in the comfortable silence between them as the market continued its noisy business all around. It was in moments like these, she realized, that she felt most at peace, more so than she had felt in years, and she found herself wondering, not for the first time, who exactly this mysterious old woman truly was, and why fate had seen fit to bring them together. That evening, as Ilara walked home with her earnings safely tucked away, she passed by Clara's stall being packed up for the night, and paused when she noticed the younger woman struggling to lift a heavy crate of unsold ribbons onto her cart. Despite their strained history, Ilara's instincts pulled her forward, and she set down her own basket to help without a word. Clara looked up in surprise, clearly not expecting assistance from someone she had treated so poorly. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, suspicion coloring her voice. "Because you looked like you needed help," Ilara said simply, lifting the crate onto the cart alongside her. Clara stared at her for a long moment, something shifting behind her guarded expression, before she muttered a quiet, almost reluctant thanks, and turned back to her packing. It was not friendship, not yet, but it was something, a small crack in the wall that had stood between them for months, and Ilara walked the rest of the way home feeling lighter than she had in days, unaware that this small act of unexpected kindness would matter far more than she could have guessed in the difficult days still waiting ahead. The storm arrived without warning on a gray afternoon, dark clouds rolling in from the hills so quickly that market vendors barely had time to cover their stalls before the first heavy drops began to fall. Within minutes, the sky had opened completely, rain hammering down in sheets so thick that the square emptied in a chaotic scramble of shouting voices and clattering carts. Ilara had just finished packing away her mended clothes when she spotted Agnes standing alone near the fountain, soaked through, her gray shawl clinging uselessly to her thin shoulders as she struggled against a sudden gust of wind. "Agnes," Ilara called out, hurrying toward her through the downpour. "Come with me, quickly, before you catch your death out here." She took the old woman's arm and guided her through the flooding streets, water rushing along the gutters and pooling in the low points of the road. Lightning splitting the sky overhead, followed almost immediately by cracks of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. By the time they reached the narrow stairwell leading up to Ilara's rented room, both of them were drenched to the bone, shivering uncontrollably in the sudden cold that had descended with the storm. Ilara wasted no time building a small fire in the modest hearth, wrapping Agnes in the only dry blanket she owned, pressing a cup of hot tea into her trembling hands. Agnes's lips had taken on a faint blue tinge, and her breathing seemed shallow and labored in a way that worried Ilara more than she wanted to admit. "You should not have stayed out in the storm so long," Ilara scolded gently, checking Agnes's forehead with the back of her hand. "You are burning up already." "I did not expect the weather to turn so quickly," Agnes murmured, her voice weaker than usual. "I am sorry to be such trouble to you, child." "You are no trouble at all," Ilara said firmly. "Now drink your tea and rest. I will not hear another word about it." But as the evening wore on, Agnes's condition worsened rather than improved. Her fever climbed steadily, and by nightfall she had begun to shiver and murmur incoherently in her sleep, tossing beneath the thin blanket despite the fire Ilara kept carefully stoked throughout the night. Ilara sat beside her through the dark hours, pressing cool cloths to her burning forehead, spooning small sips of broth between her cracked lips whenever she stirred enough to swallow, refusing to leave her side even as exhaustion pulled at her own eyelids. In her fevered state, Agnes began to speak, fragments of sentences slipping from her lips that made little sense to Ilara at the time. She spoke of a great house with tall windows, of servants bowing in long hallways, of a portrait gallery lined with the faces of ancestors long since passed. She spoke of an argument, harsh words exchanged with someone she called her son, about duty and freedom, and the weight of a title she had never wanted to carry alone. "He does not understand," Agnes muttered, her eyes moving restlessly beneath closed lids. "He thinks the estate is everything, but I only wanted to remember what it felt like to be seen as a person again, not merely a duchess sitting in a gilded chair." Alara frowned at these strange murmurings, dismissing them as the meaningless wanderings of a fevered mind, though a small, curious part of her filed each word away, wondering at their strange specificity. Surely an old woman living in poverty near the market square could have no real connection to duchesses and grand estates. It was simply the fever speaking, conjuring images from stories she must have heard long ago, nothing more. By the second night, Agnes's fever had climbed even higher, and Alara, growing desperate, spent nearly all of the silver coin Agnes herself had given her days before on medicine from the town apothecary, a bitter-tasting tonic the old healer swore would break even the most stubborn fevers if administered properly. She did not hesitate for a moment before spending the money, despite knowing it meant she would once again struggle to make her rent that month. Agnes's health mattered more to her than any coin ever could. She barely slept those 2 nights, catching only brief snatches of rest in the hard wooden chair beside the bed, waking at every small sound Agnes made, checking her temperature with anxious fingers, whispering soft reassurances even when she knew the old woman could not hear them. On the 3rd morning, as pale sunlight finally broke through the retreating storm clouds, Agnes's fever broke at last, and she woke with clearer eyes than she had shown in days, though weak and disoriented. "Where am I?" she asked softly, her voice hoarse from disuse. "You are safe," Alara said, relief flooding through her chest so strongly it nearly brought tears to her eyes. "You have been very ill, but the fever has broken. You are going to be all right." Agnes looked around the small, humble room, taking in the modest furnishings, the low fire still burning in the hearth, the exhausted young woman sitting beside her bed with dark circles beneath her eyes from days of sleepless care. Something in her expression shifted, softening into an emotion that looked almost like guilt. "You have taken such good care of me," Agnes said quietly. "I do not know how I will ever repay such kindness." "You already tried to repay kindness with money once," Alara said, managing a tired smile. "I told you then, and I will tell you now, I did not do this expecting anything in return." Agnes reached out and took Alara's hand, holding it gently between her own weathered palms. There was a long silence between them, filled with something unspoken, before Agnes finally spoke again, her voice careful and measured. "There are things about me you do not know, Alara," she said slowly. "Things I have kept hidden, not out of dishonesty, but out of a need to simply exist as myself for a while, without the weight of who I am pressing down on every conversation, every relationship. I have family, important family, who do not know where I have been these past weeks. I left without explanation, and I am certain they are searching for me even now." Ilara's brow furrowed with concern. "Are you in some kind of danger?" she asked. "Is someone after you?" "No, nothing like that," Agnes reassured her quickly. "It is simply a complicated situation, one I am not yet ready to fully explain. But I need you to understand that when the truth eventually comes to light, it may change how you see me, and I would not blame you if it did. Nothing could change how I see you," Alara said firmly. "You have been kind to me when you had no reason to be. That matters far more than any secret you might be keeping." Agnes squeezed her hand gratefully, though the worried crease remained on her brow, as though she carried a burden Alara could not yet understand. Before either of them could say anything further, a sharp knock sounded at the door downstairs, followed by the sound of Ilara's landlord calling up the stairwell. "Ilara Voss, there are men here asking about a missing woman." Edmund Price's voice carried up through the narrow stairwell, edged with suspicion. "They say she may have been seen in this part of town. You would not know anything about that, would you?" Ilara's heart lurched painfully in her chest. She glanced at Agnes, whose face had gone pale despite her recent recovery, and understood immediately that whoever was searching for her must be connected to the very secrets Agnes had just begun to hint at. Without thinking twice, Ilara moved quickly to the door, opening it only a crack. "I know nothing of any missing woman," she called down, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the frantic pounding of her own heart. "I have been caring for a sick relative these past days, nothing more." She heard low voices exchanging words below, could not make out their exact content, but after several tense moments that felt to Ilara like hours, the sound of footsteps retreated back down the stairs and out into the street. She closed the door softly and turned back to Agnes, who had struggled to sit up despite her weakness, her expression tight with worry. They will not stop searching, Agnes said quietly. My family has resources you cannot imagine, and they will not rest until they find me. I am so sorry to have brought this danger to your doorstep. I do not care about danger, Alara said, moving back to sit beside the bed. I care about you getting well again. Whatever comes after that, we will face it together, if you will allow me to stand beside you. Agnes looked at her for a long moment, something fierce and grateful blazing behind her tired eyes, before she nodded slowly, as though coming to some private decision. Very well, she said. When I am strong enough to travel, I believe it is time you learned the truth of who I really am, and what that truth might mean for both of us. I only hope you can forgive me for the deception, however unintentional it began. There is nothing to forgive, Alara said gently, though a small knot of anxiety had begun to form in her stomach, a quiet dread of what revelations might be waiting just beyond the horizon of the coming days. Rest now, the truth will keep until you are strong enough to carry it. Agnes settled back against the pillow, her eyes drifting closed once more, though this time in peaceful sleep rather than fevered delirium. Alara remained beside her through the rest of that day, watching the color slowly return to the old woman's cheeks, unaware that outside the narrow walls of her rented room, a search that had spanned 3 counties was drawing steadily closer, and that the quiet peace of the past several days was about to be shattered entirely by the arrival of someone neither of them could avoid for much longer. 3 days after the search party had knocked on Alara's door, a carriage finer than any she had ever seen rolled into the narrow street outside her rented room, drawn by 2 matched black horses and flanked by 4 mounted riders in dark green livery. Word spread through the neighborhood almost instantly, curious faces appearing at windows and doorways as the carriage came to a halt, and a tall man stepped down onto the cobblestones, his presence commanding immediate attention despite his plain traveling clothes. He was young, perhaps 30 years of age, with dark hair swept back from a sharp, handsome face and eyes that scanned the street with the focused intensity of a hawk searching for prey. Alara watched from her window above, her stomach tightening with a nervous premonition, as the man exchanged brief words with one of his mounted companions, before striding directly toward the building where she lived. Agnes, still weak but much improved, had been resting near the fire when the commotion outside drew her attention. She rose slowly and moved to the window beside Alara, and the moment her eyes fell on the tall figure below, her breath caught sharply in her throat. "Alaric," she whispered, her hand pressing against her chest. "Who is that?" Alara asked, though some instinct already told her the answer mattered more than she was prepared for. "That is my son," Agnes said quietly. "Alara, I must tell you now, before he reaches this door, exactly who I am. My name is not simply Agnes. I am Margaret Thornwood, Dowager Duchess of Ashcombe, and the man standing outside is my son, Alaric Thornwood, the current Duke." The words hit Alara like a physical blow, and she stared at Agnes in stunned silence, pieces of the past weeks rearranging themselves rapidly in her mind. The soft hands, the fine embroidered handkerchief, the strange fevered murmurings about estates and portraits and duty, all of it suddenly made a terrible, dizzying kind of sense.
"You are a duchess."
Alara finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper.
"I am,"
Margaret confirmed, watching Alara's face carefully. "I left the estate weeks ago because I could no longer bear the isolation of that life, surrounded by servants who feared me and courtiers who flattered me, never once treated as simply a person worthy of genuine kindness. I disguised myself and came to this town seeking something I had lost long ago, and I found it in you, Alara Voss, in a way I never expected." Before Alara could formulate any response, heavy footsteps sounded on the stairwell outside, followed by a firm knock at the door. Margaret drew herself up despite her lingering weakness, and Alara, still reeling from the revelation, moved to open the door with trembling hands. The Duke stood in the doorway, his sharp eyes immediately finding his mother across the small room, and for a moment, raw relief broke through his composed expression, before he schooled his features back into careful control. "Mother," he said, his voice tight with barely contained emotion. "Do you have any idea what these past weeks have done to me? I have had search parties combing 3 counties. I have barely slept. I have imagined every terrible possibility 100 times over, and I find you here, in a rented room above a cobbler's shop, looking as though nothing at all has happened." "I am sorry to have caused you such worry, Alaric," Margaret said, though her tone carried no true regret for her actions, only genuine remorse for the pain they had caused. "But I needed to remember what it felt like to simply exist as a woman, not as a title, not as a duty to be managed and protected at every turn." The Duke's gaze shifted then to Alara, standing quietly near the doorway, taking in her simple clothing, the modest room around them, the careful way she watched the exchange between mother and son as though uncertain of her place within it. His expression, initially guarded, shifted into something more curious as he studied her. "And who is this?" he asked, though his tone had softened somewhat from the sharp worry of moments before. "This is Alara Voss," Margaret said, reaching out to take Alara's hand and drawing her forward slightly. "She is the reason I am standing here alive and well today, Alaric. She defended me from cruel men in the marketplace without knowing who I was. She nursed me through a dangerous fever these past days, spending her own hard-earned coins on medicine, sitting at my bedside through sleepless nights, expecting nothing in return. I owe this young woman a debt I could never fully repay." The Duke's expression shifted again, surprise and something almost like admiration crossing his features as he looked at Alara with new consideration. He stepped forward and offered a formal bow, a gesture Alara had certainly never received from anyone of rank before, let alone a duke. "Then it seems I owe you my deepest gratitude as well, Miss Voss," he said. "My mother's safety and health mean more to me than I could easily express, and it appears you have safeguarded both while asking for nothing in exchange. That speaks to a character I do not often encounter, particularly among the circles I am accustomed to moving within." Alara felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment at the formal praise, unused to such attention, and unsure how to properly respond to a man of such elevated station addressing her so directly. "I only did what anyone should have done," she said quietly. "Your mother did not deserve the cruelty she faced that day, and she certainly did not deserve to suffer alone through her illness afterward. Not everyone shares your instinct for kindness," the Duke said. "In my experience, far too few do." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of raised voices from the street below, and moments later, Edmund Price appeared in the doorway behind the Duke's mounted guards, his expression a mixture of confusion and calculation, as he took in the fine carriage and armed riders, surrounding what he had always considered an unremarkable building, full of unremarkable tenants. "Your Grace," he said, bowing awkwardly, clearly having pieced together the situation from whispers among the crowd gathering outside. "I hope there has been no trouble in my building. If this young woman has caused any offense to your family, I assure you I had no knowledge of it. I would have evicted her long ago had I known she was harboring persons of such importance without proper disclosure." Alara's stomach twisted with fresh anxiety at the landlord's transparent attempt to distance himself from any blame while simultaneously implying wrongdoing on her part. But the Duke's expression hardened immediately, his earlier warmth replaced by cool authority. "This young woman has done nothing but show extraordinary kindness to my mother during a time of genuine need," he said, his voice carrying an edge of steel that made Edmund's face pale considerably. "I understand you have been threatening her with eviction over rent. Is that correct?" Edmund stammered, clearly caught off guard by how much information the Duke already possessed. "I only require tenants to pay on schedule, Your Grace, as is only fair business practice." The Duke's expression remained cold. "Miss Voss's rent, for as long as she wishes to remain in this building, will be settled through my estate from this day forward," he said firmly, "and I would advise you to treat her with considerably more respect going forward, given the regard my family now holds for her character." Edmund's protests died in his throat, and he bowed hastily, backing out of the doorway with obvious relief at escaping further scrutiny. Once he had gone, the Duke turned back to Alara, his expression softening once more, though something thoughtful remained behind his sharp eyes as he studied her. "I hope you will forgive the intrusion of resolving matters so directly," he said. "My mother's well-being tends to bring out a certain protective instinct in me that I do not always manage to temper with patience." "I do not mind at all," Alara said honestly, still somewhat overwhelmed by the speed at which her circumstances seemed to be shifting around her. "Though I confess, I do not quite know what happens now. Your mother, I mean, the Duchess, will be returning to the estate with you, I imagine." Margaret, who had been watching the exchange with quiet interest, stepped forward and took both Alara's hands in her own, her expression earnest and warm, despite the lingering weakness from her illness. "I will not simply disappear from your life after everything you have done for me, Alara," she said firmly. "Whatever else changes now that the truth is known, that much will remain constant. You have become dear to me these past weeks, and I do not intend to let a title stand between us." Alara felt tears prick unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity in the older woman's voice, though a quiet, anxious voice in the back of her mind continued to whisper doubts about how such a friendship could possibly survive the vast gulf between a penniless orphan and a duchess of the realm. She said nothing of these doubts aloud, however, simply nodding and returning the gentle pressure of Margaret's hands with her own. The Duke watched this exchange with an expression Ilara could not quite decipher, something contemplative and searching in his gaze as it moved between his mother and the young woman who had so unexpectedly become important to her. Before he could speak further, one of his mounted guards appeared in the doorway, reporting that the carriage was ready, and that the roads back toward the estate would need to be traveled before nightfall to avoid the risk of another sudden storm. "We should depart soon," the Duke said, though his tone carried a note of reluctance that surprised even himself. "Mother, are you well enough to travel?" "I am," Margaret said, though she turned back to Ilara with clear hesitation in her expression, unwilling to simply walk away without some assurance of continued connection between them. "Ilara, will you permit me to write to you, once I have returned home and settled matters at the estate? I meant what I said. I do not intend for this friendship to end simply because circumstances have shifted so dramatically. I would be glad to receive your letters," Ilara said, managing a small smile despite the swirl of uncertain emotions churning within her chest. As the Duke helped his mother toward the waiting carriage, guiding her carefully down the narrow stairwell with a tenderness that spoke volumes about the true depth of his concern for her, he paused briefly at the base of the stairs and looked back up toward Ilara, still standing in the doorway of her small rented room. "Thank you again, Miss Voss," he said quietly, his tone carrying a sincerity that seemed to surprise even him. "I suspect our paths have not yet finished crossing." Ilara watched as the carriage pulled away down the narrow street, the mounted guards falling into formation around it, the curious crowd slowly dispersing back to their daily business, now that the excitement had passed. She remained standing in the doorway long after the carriage had disappeared from sight, her mind spinning with everything that had just unfolded, the sudden and dramatic revelation of Agnes's true identity, the Duke's unexpected warmth despite his initial sharp authority, and the quiet, persistent question of what exactly the coming days might bring for a penniless orphan who had somehow, without ever intending it, found herself tangled in the affairs of nobility. She did not know, as she finally closed the door and returned to the quiet solitude of her small room, that the letters Margaret had promised would arrive far sooner than expected, nor that they would carry with them an invitation that would challenge everything Ilara believed about her place in the world, setting into motion a chain of events that neither she nor the Thornwood family could have fully anticipated on that gray afternoon, when the truth had finally come to light. The letter arrived exactly 9 days after the carriage had vanished down the narrow street, carried by a liveried messenger who drew as much attention from Ilara's neighbors as the Duke's visit had before it. Sealed with the Thornwood family crest, pressed into deep green wax, the letter contained an invitation in Margaret's own careful handwriting, requesting that Ilara travel to Ashcombe Estate as a guest of honor, to celebrate her full recovery from illness, and to properly express the family's gratitude for her kindness. Ilara read the letter 3 times before she fully believed its contents, her hands trembling slightly as she traced the elegant script across the heavy paper. Part of her wanted desperately to accept, curious beyond measure to see the grand estate Margaret had once described in feverish murmurs, eager to continue the friendship that had grown so unexpectedly precious to her. But another part of her, quieter and more anxious, whispered warnings about the vast difference between her humble circumstances and the glittering world of nobility she would be stepping into, a world where she would surely stand out as an outsider who did not belong. She wrote back accepting the invitation nonetheless, telling herself that Margaret deserved the courtesy of a proper farewell if nothing else, and within days found herself seated in a modest carriage sent specifically to collect her, watching the familiar streets of her small town give way to rolling countryside she had never before had reason to see. Ashcombe Estate, when it finally came into view, took her breath away entirely. Sprawling green lawns stretched toward a magnificent stone building with towers and countless windows catching the afternoon sunlight, fountains splashing in elaborate gardens, servants moving briskly about their duties along the long gravel drive. Ilara stepped down from the carriage feeling impossibly small against the grandeur surrounding her, smoothing her simple dress with nervous hands as Margaret herself hurried down the front steps to greet her, looking healthier and more radiant than Ilara had ever seen her. "Ilara, you came," Margaret said warmly, embracing her without hesitation despite the watching eyes of several servants nearby. "I was so hopeful, but part of me feared you might reconsider once you had time to think it over." "I almost did," Ilara admitted honestly. "This is all rather overwhelming." Margaret laughed softly, looping her arm through Ilara's as she guided her toward the grand entrance. "Come, let me show you around properly, and you will see soon enough that grand stone walls do not change the value of genuine friendship, however unfamiliar the surroundings might feel at first." The following days passed in a strange, dreamlike blur for Ilara, filled with more comfort and luxury than she had ever imagined experiencing. She was given a spacious guest room with a soft bed and windows overlooking the gardens, meals finer than anything she had tasted in years, and Margaret's constant warm company throughout each day, walking the grounds together, sharing stories, laughing over small jokes that had nothing to do with rank or title. The Duke, too, found reasons to seek her out during those first days, initially under the guise of ensuring she had everything she required as a guest, though their conversations soon deepened beyond simple courtesy. Ilara found herself surprised by his dry sense of humor, so different from the sharp authority he had displayed the day he arrived at her rented room, and by the genuine interest he seemed to take in her opinions on matters ranging from the management of the estate's tenant farms to her own modest dreams of one day owning a proper shop. "You think about these things carefully," he observed one afternoon as they walked together along a garden path, Margaret resting nearby on a stone bench, watching the two of them with quiet, knowing satisfaction. "Most people I speak with simply tell me what they believe I wish to hear." "I have never had the luxury of telling people what they wish to hear," Ilara said honestly. "I have always had to say what I actually believed, because pretending otherwise never put food on my table or coins in my pocket." The Duke smiled at this, something warm flickering behind his sharp eyes. "It is a rare and valuable trait," he said. "I find myself valuing your honesty more with each conversation we share, Miss Voss." Not everyone at Ashcombe Estate shared such warm sentiments toward the unexpected guest, however. Lady Beatrice Winthrop, a distant cousin of the Thornwood family who had long harbored hopes of securing the Duke's attention for her own daughter, watched Ilara's growing presence within the household with increasing suspicion and thinly veiled hostility. She cornered Ilara one afternoon near the east garden, her tone dripping with false courtesy that barely concealed the sharp edge beneath. "It is quite remarkable, is it not?" Lady Beatrice said, "how quickly a common market girl has found herself so comfortably settled among people of genuine breeding. One might almost suspect some manner of scheming behind such rapid advancement." Ilara felt her cheeks warm with anger at the implication, but she kept her voice carefully level, refusing to give the older woman the satisfaction of an outburst. "I have not schemed for anything," she said calmly. "I simply helped someone in need, without knowing who she was, and friendship grew naturally from that act." "How convenient," Lady Beatrice said, her smile thin and unpleasant. "Friendship that happens to come with fine rooms and expensive gowns provided at the Duke's own expense. Do be careful, dear girl, that you do not overstep boundaries that were never meant for someone of your station to cross. The Duke has responsibilities to consider, obligations to his family name that a passing infatuation with a common orphan could seriously jeopardize." The words stung more than Ilara wanted to admit, striking directly at the anxious doubts she had carried since first receiving Margaret's invitation, and she retreated from the conversation feeling shaken, the earlier comfort of her days at the estate suddenly clouded with fresh uncertainty about whether she truly belonged within these grand walls at all. That evening, during a formal dinner attended by several members of the extended Thornwood family and prominent local nobility, Lady Beatrice found further opportunity to needle at Ilara's sense of security, making pointed comments throughout the meal about proper etiquette and the importance of maintaining appropriate social boundaries, each remark aimed with careful precision at highlighting Ilara's unfamiliarity with the customs surrounding her. Ilara endured the evening with as much grace as she could manage, though by the time the meal finally concluded, she felt utterly drained, retreating to the quiet solitude of the garden rather than joining the others for evening conversation in the drawing room. She was standing alone beneath a large oak tree, staring up at the star-filled sky, and wondering whether she had made a terrible mistake in accepting Margaret's invitation, when she heard footsteps approaching along the garden path. She turned to find the Duke walking toward her, his expression concerned in the dim lantern light spilling from the nearby windows. "You left the drawing room rather abruptly," he said, coming to stand beside her beneath the tree. "Is something troubling you?" Ilara hesitated, uncertain whether to voice the doubts weighing so heavily on her chest, but something in his steady, patient gaze encouraged honesty rather than polite deflection. "I do not think I belong here," she finally admitted. "Lady Beatrice has made it quite clear that I am overstepping boundaries that were never meant for someone like me, and perhaps she is not entirely wrong. I am a market girl who mends clothes for coppers. I do not know the proper way to hold a silver fork, let alone navigate the complicated politics of noble society." The Duke's expression hardened slightly at the mention of Lady Beatrice's words, though when he spoke, his tone remained gentle. "Lady Beatrice speaks from jealousy and disappointed ambition, nothing more," he said firmly. "She has long hoped to see her daughter secure my attention, and your presence here threatens plans she has quietly nurtured for years. Her opinion of your worth carries no true authority in this household, regardless of how forcefully she voices it. But she is not entirely wrong about the difference between us," Ilara said quietly. "I truly do not belong in this world, however kindly your mother has welcomed me into it." The Duke turned to face her fully then, his expression earnest in the soft lantern light. "Belonging is not measured by knowledge of silver forks or the proper etiquette for formal dinners, Alara," he said. "It is measured by character, by kindness, by the courage to stand up for someone in need without any expectation of reward. You possess more genuine worth than half the nobility gathered in that drawing room tonight, myself included on certain days. My mother recognized that worth from the very first moment she met you, and I have come to recognize it as well, more deeply with each passing day you have spent here." Alara stared at him, her heart pounding at the sincerity in his voice, uncertain how to respond to words that seemed to carry far more weight than simple reassurance between friends. Before she could formulate any reply, Margaret's voice called softly from the garden path behind them, and both turned to see her approaching, having apparently overheard at least part of their conversation. "I could not help but overhear," Margaret said, coming to stand beside them. "And I want you to know, Alara, that whatever doubts Lady Beatrice has planted in your mind, they hold no truth within these walls. You have given me back a piece of myself I thought lost forever, a genuine friendship untainted by flattery or hidden agenda. That gift is more valuable to me than any title or fortune this family possesses, and I will not allow anyone, cousin or otherwise, to make you feel unwelcome in a home where you are so deeply valued." Tears gathered in Alara's eyes at the fierce sincerity in Margaret's words, and she found herself embraced warmly once again, the older woman's arms wrapping around her with genuine affection that finally began to quiet the anxious doubts that had plagued her throughout the difficult evening. The following morning matters came to an unexpected head when Lady Beatrice, emboldened by what she perceived as a lack of consequence for her earlier remarks, attempted to have Alara quietly removed from the estate under the pretense of arranging alternate lodging in the nearby village, claiming such arrangements would be more suitable and comfortable for someone unaccustomed to grand households. She made these arrangements without consulting either Margaret or the Duke directly, assuming her standing within the family would prevent any serious challenge to her decision. When Margaret discovered what had transpired, her reaction was swift and unmistakably firm. She called for Lady Beatrice directly, and in a conversation that several household staff later described in hushed, admiring tones, made unmistakably clear that Alara Voss remained a welcomed and valued guest at Ashcombe Estate for as long as she wished to remain, and that any further attempts to undermine her position within the household would result in Lady Beatrice's own welcome being reconsidered entirely. Lady Beatrice, thoroughly chastened and clearly unprepared for such a direct confrontation, offered a stiff apology to Alara later that same day, though the sincerity behind her words remained questionable at best. Still, the incident settled matters definitively within the household, and Alara found the remaining days of her visit far more peaceful, the whispered doubts and pointed comments fading considerably now that the family's true feelings had been made so publicly clear. It was during a quiet evening walk through the rose gardens, several weeks into her extended stay, that the Duke finally spoke words that would alter the entire course of Alara's future. They had fallen into a comfortable habit of walking together each evening after dinner, conversations ranging freely between estate matters, shared memories, and gentle teasing that had grown increasingly warm between them over the passing weeks. "Alara," he said, stopping beneath an arch heavy with climbing roses, his expression more serious than she had seen it in some time, "I find myself in an unusual position, one I did not anticipate when I first arrived at your rented room those months ago seeking my missing mother. I came searching for her safety and found, quite unexpectedly, a young woman whose character and courage have left a far deeper impression on me than I ever could have predicted." Alara's heart began to pound as she listened, uncertain where this unexpected declaration was leading, though hope stirred cautiously beneath her ribs despite her best efforts to remain composed. "I am not asking you to answer anything tonight," the Duke continued, his voice carrying an earnestness she had not heard from him before. "But I want you to know that whatever title separates us in the eyes of society, it has never once mattered to me in matters of the heart. I find myself caring for you deeply, Alara Voss, not for who society believes you should be, but for exactly who you already are." Alara stood beneath the fragrant roses, overwhelmed by emotions she had spent weeks trying carefully to suppress, and found herself speaking honestly, as she always did, without artifice or careful calculation. "I care for you as well," she admitted softly. "I have tried to convince myself otherwise these past weeks, certain that such feelings could only lead to disappointment given the vast difference in our stations, but I find I can no longer deny what my heart has known for some time now." The Duke's expression brightened with a warmth that transformed his usually composed features entirely, and he reached out to take her hand gently within his own. "Then perhaps," he said, "we might find a way to bridge that difference together, rather than allowing it to keep us apart." Margaret, watching quietly from a nearby garden bench where she had settled to enjoy the cool evening air, smiled with quiet satisfaction as she observed the tender scene unfolding before her, feeling certain that the strange twist of fate which had first brought her together with a penniless orphan in a crowded marketplace had led, through unexpected trials and genuine connection, to precisely the outcome her heart had quietly hoped for all along. News of the Duke's growing affection for a former market girl spread through noble circles far faster than anyone at Ashcombe Estate could have anticipated, carried along by servants' whispers and the eager tongues of visiting relatives who had witnessed the tender exchange in the rose garden that evening. Within days, the story had traveled well beyond the estate walls, reaching the ears of distant nobility who viewed the match with a mixture of scandalized fascination and outright disapproval, certain that a Duke of Alaric Thornwood's standing could not possibly consider marriage to someone of such humble origin without bringing shame upon the entire family name. Letters arrived at the estate in growing numbers, some offering cautious congratulations, others expressing thinly veiled outrage at what several correspondents called a reckless disregard for centuries of family tradition. The Duke read each letter with careful patience, discussing the more pointed criticisms with his mother late into several evenings, weighing the practical consequences such a match might carry for the estate's standing among its peers. Elara, watching this quiet storm of disapproval unfold around her, found herself once again questioning whether her presence at Ashcombe might ultimately cause more harm than good, however genuine the affection shared between herself and the Duke had become. She raised these concerns directly one evening, finding Alaric alone in the estate's modest library, surrounded by stacks of correspondence he had been steadily working through since the news had first spread. "Perhaps it would be simpler for everyone involved if I returned to my old life," she said quietly, watching his reaction carefully. "I do not wish to become a source of ongoing conflict between you and families whose good opinion your estate depends upon." The Duke set down the letter he had been reading and looked at her with an expression that held no trace of doubt or hesitation. "I did not ask for your opinion on whether you should stay," he said gently, rising to cross the room toward her. "I am telling you now, clearly and without reservation, that I have no intention of allowing the disapproval of distant relatives or jealous nobility to dictate matters of my own heart. My mother taught me, through her own courage in seeking a simpler life these past months, that true worth has nothing whatsoever to do with title or birth. I believe that lesson completely, and I will not abandon it now simply because a handful of letters express displeasure. But your family's reputation," Elara pressed, still uncertain despite the warmth of his reassurance. "Reputation built upon cruelty and rigid prejudice is not a reputation worth preserving," the Duke said firmly. "I would rather stand beside someone of genuine character and weather whatever criticism follows, than marry according to expectation, and live a lifetime regretting the choice." Margaret, who had been quietly listening from the library doorway, stepped forward to add her own voice to the conversation, her expression resolute. "I disappeared for weeks, specifically because I grew weary of measuring my worth through the narrow lens of noble expectation," she said. "I will not watch my son make the same mistake I nearly made throughout my own younger years, choosing duty over genuine happiness. Elara, you belong here, not because anyone has granted you permission, but because you have earned your place through actions far more meaningful than any title could ever provide." Over the following months, the Duke took deliberate steps to solidify Elara's position within noble society, hosting a formal gathering at Ashcombe Estate specifically to introduce her properly to the surrounding nobility, ensuring she received the same courtesies and respect afforded to any guest of genuine standing. He spoke openly and proudly of her courage in defending his mother, without knowing her true identity, of her selfless care during the dangerous fever that had followed, framing her humble origins not as a liability to be hidden away, but as evidence of exactly the character he valued most in a future partner. Slowly, gathering by gathering, opinion within the wider nobility began to shift, particularly as more people had opportunity to meet Elara directly, and witness for themselves the genuine warmth and quiet dignity she carried, so different from the calculated flattery many had expected from someone supposedly seeking to elevate her station through marriage. Even Lady Beatrice, whose earlier hostility had never fully faded, found herself grudgingly admitting to other guests that the young woman possessed a certain admirable steadiness that many higher-born ladies of her acquaintance sorely lacked. Elara, for her part, refused to abandon the values that had shaped her throughout her difficult years of poverty and loss. She insisted on continuing correspondence with old market friends, including Clara Ashford, whose earlier rivalry had gradually transformed into genuine friendship, following that single act of unexpected kindness, helping load a heavy crate onto a cart. She used a portion of the generous allowance the Duke insisted upon providing to establish a small fund supporting struggling market vendors during difficult seasons, remembering vividly her own years of anxious uncertainty over unpaid rent and dwindling savings. She also, with Margaret's enthusiastic encouragement, finally pursued the modest dream she had once shared during a quiet afternoon near the market fountain, establishing a proper shop specializing in fine mended and refashioned clothing, employing several young women from difficult backgrounds similar to her own, teaching them skills that offered genuine independence rather than charity alone. The shop, situated in the very market square where her story with Margaret had first begun, became known throughout the region for both the quality of its craftsmanship and the fair, generous treatment extended to every worker within its walls. On the day of her wedding to Alaric Thornwood, held not within the imposing formality of a grand cathedral, but in the simple, sunlit gardens of Ashcombe Estate where their quiet evening walks had first blossomed into genuine affection, Alara stood surrounded by an unusual gathering that perfectly reflected the life she had built. Market vendors stood alongside titled nobility. Former rivals sat beside lifelong friends, and Margaret, radiant with happiness, occupied a place of honor beside her son, as he exchanged vows with the penniless orphan who had once defended her without any knowledge of who she truly was. As the ceremony concluded and the assembled guests began the joyful celebration that would continue late into the evening, Margaret found a quiet moment alone with Alara near the same rose-covered arch where Alaric had first spoken of his growing affection months before. "Do you remember," Margaret said softly, taking Alara's hands within her own weathered palms, "that very first day in the marketplace, when you stepped between me and those cruel men without a moment's hesitation?" "I remember it as though it happened only yesterday," Alara said, smiling warmly at the memory. "I have thought often, in the months since, about what might have happened had you simply looked away like everyone else in that crowded square," Margaret continued. "I might have wandered that town indefinitely, disguised and unknown, searching for something I could not quite name. Instead, I found not only the genuine friendship I had been seeking, but a daughter of the heart, and happiness for my son that I had long since stopped believing possible." Alara felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the profound journey that had unfolded since that single moment of instinctive courage in a crowded marketplace. "You gave me a family when I believed myself entirely alone in this world," she said softly. "I think we saved each other that day, in ways neither of us could have possibly understood at the time. Perhaps that is simply how genuine kindness works," Margaret said, smiling gently as the sound of music and laughter drifted toward them from the celebration continuing across the garden. "It rarely announces its true purpose in the moment it occurs. It simply plants a small seed, and trusts that time and patience will allow it to grow into something far greater than anyone could have originally imagined." As the evening deepened into a canopy of stars above Ashcombe Estate, and the celebration continued joyfully among nobility and common folk alike, gathered together without distinction of rank, Alara found herself reflecting on the remarkable distance she had traveled since that gray morning in the market square, when a shouting merchant and a humiliated old woman had set into motion a chain of events far beyond anything a penniless orphan could ever have dared to dream. She had lost her parents young, faced years of loneliness and uncertainty, and yet through one instinctive act of courage and kindness toward a stranger in need, had found not only love and belonging, but the profound understanding that true worth had never depended upon circumstance or birth, only upon the choices made when no one else was watching, and the quiet, unwavering commitment to treat every person, regardless of their appearance or apparent station, with the dignity and compassion they deserved. The story of the penniless orphan who had defended a humiliated old woman, never knowing she stood before the mother of a duke, became something of a quiet legend throughout the region in the years that followed, told and retold, not as a tale of fortune found through chance encounter, but as a gentle reminder that genuine kindness, offered freely and without expectation of reward, carries the power to transform not only the life of the person receiving it, but the very course of history itself, one small, courageous choice at a time.